Okay, right. Here we go. What is this? Week 10, week 11? I don't know. I've lost count, and it's nice to see some familiar faces, including Kumar, I think from Sri Lanka. Nice to see you signing in every week, and welcome again for such a long distance away. And of course, we have the ever faithful Sud-West branch. They're just making sure that I'm keeping up with what they're talking about. Sad this week. I'd like to go public on the death of a chap who used to work for me, whom I haven't seen for many years, Terry Christie. He ended up as a flight sergeant mover, but sadly he took his own life at the beginning of May. And again, my heartfelt sorrow goes out to his family and his close friends. So enough for that. It's the usual catch up. What have I been doing this week? Well, a very enjoyable 2 days doing my tax return. Something I have to do because the tax man makes sure that despite having an Air Force pension, everything else I do, which is renting out houses in the UK and renting out houses in France, has to be taxed separately, and that includes also my writing. So something I look forward to intensely every year, and then sort of worry sick about it and get it done. But it's done now. My book on the Dornier 217, finished the manuscript and submitted that, so that's another thing off the list. So it's a case of catching up with little bits and pieces and thinking about the future. And of course, the future which landed on my desk yesterday was, can I please now do an index for Brothers in Arms, which I discussed last week for those of you who signed in. And last week I explained the book and actually covered the RAF side, and promised this week that maybe to add a sort of, a bit of a complete part of the story, that I would actually mention the German side. For those who didn't book in last week, Brothers in Arms was my first book, which was, well, it was published as I and my family were leaving Bryce Norton to go to Cyprus for a 3-year tour. And the publisher actually turned up at the Gateway House Hotel for me to sign copies of the book before I disappeared off. 3 years out in Cyprus didn't sort of materialize, because the Air Force, in its wisdom, 6 months after I got out there, decided that I was worthy enough to be promoted, so therefore came all the way back again, which wasn't very much fun. When we went out there, we had a 2-month-old, a 2-year-old, and a 4-year-old, and they weren't much older when they came back again. But there we go. So the book came out 25, 26 years ago, and at long last, it has been decided, especially this year being the anniversary year of the Battle of Britain, the big anniversary year, that my book will be republished. And again, it is the story of a German fighter unit and an RAF Spitfire squadron in the Battle of Britain, who met each other on 2 occasions in August 1940, and then met themselves again in June 1941, but that was where it ended. So you can see that was the scope of the book, and it's sort of, gives a potted history of the RAF squadron, the German squadron, the 2 days they met, what they did in the Battle of Britain, and then how it all ended up, which was, as I think I said then, was a mid-air collision between the Spitfire flight commander and an NCO pilot, both of whom would have met in combat in August 1940. So that's the RAF side was done last week. So what about the German side? Now, the German side, the unit is called 1 Staffel Jagdgeschwader 53, which equates to the 1st squadron of the 1st wing of fighter group 53. The Germans organized their squadron slightly different to us, as opposed to 201 squadron, 609 squadron, 1 squadron were a standalone squadron of, say, 12 to 14 Spitfires. The Germans used to organize themselves into much bigger groups. So to give you an example for the 1st Staffel of JG53, or the 1st squadron of JG53, there would be another 2 squadrons within the 1st wing. That would be then commanded by what they call a Gruppenkommandeur, which effectively is a wing commander. And then there would be a 2nd group, which would have 3 squadrons, and a 3rd group, which would have 3 squadrons as well. So they would all be, they would then go to form what was known as a Geschwader, and they would be commanded by a Geschwader Commodore. On the bomber side, they tended to be a wing commander rank, occasionally group captain rank, but fighter-wise, they tended to be commanded by a squadron leader. A bit of a sort of a disconnect between the RAF there. But effectively, one JG-53 is a squadron, and 609 Squadron, the Spitfire Squadron, which the book's about, is an equivalent and roughly about 12 to 14 aircraft in each. Now, the interesting thing about the fighter wing 53, it was known as the Ace of Spades group, and this is what they used to carry on the cowlings of their Messerschmitt 109s. Why? The Germans are quite interested into their heraldry and having badges on their aircraft, and that's normally how you could identify the different units. You know, RAF fighters had their own individual squadron codes on the fuselage. The Germans used to have special badges or special markings, and for this German unit, their badge was an Ace of Spades. However, they did incur the wrath of German high command during the Battle of Britain. For some unknown reason, we don't really know what happened, and as a result, they were ordered to remove these Ace of Spades badges off the cowlings of their aircraft. And in response, the fighter pilots, typical fighter pilots, removed the swastikas off the rudders of their aircraft and put a red ring around it. Don't ask me why, it's been lost in the mist of times, but apparently they did do something which really annoyed Goering or somebody beneath him, and as a result, even though they were called the Ace of Spades unit, they weren't the Ace of Spades until they were allowed to put these markings back on their aircraft after the Battle of Britain. And at the same size, they said, in that case, we'll put the swastikas back on the tail. So what was this unit? Well, this unit had its origins before the start of the war. A number of its pilots had fought in Spain, and the actual squadron commander was effectively the father of the Luftwaffe fighter service, Werner Mulders. He was the top scoring ace in the Spanish Civil War, so much so that when he returned to Germany with the highest decoration he could get at the time, he was assigned to the German Air Ministry, where he was the person who came up with the new tactics that they tried and tested out in Spain, which were much better than the ones the RAF had. The RAF fighters, they had a textbook, and it was very, very rigid. This is why they flew in these Vicks, and Vicks were not very, very good. The Germans came up with the finger four formation, which was adopted by the RAF as the war developed, but was found to be very, very good. So when they turned, a pair would turn and cover each other, then another pair would turn. So that's, you know, it was a very, very effective way of doing things. And it also meant that in a formation of four, that gave them a higher degree of independence. So they were flying Messerschmitt 109s at the outbreak of war, but they didn't do very much. Their war was actually they were based at Wiesbaden in Germany, and their war was countering French aircraft, French fighters, which occasionally came up in the phony war. Well, the French called it the drôle de guerre. We called it the phony war. The Germans called it Sitzkrieg, i.e. sitting war. It was very much a parrying and people just testing to see how it goes. And one of the first casualties, and that was an accident, was Werner Mulders. He was slightly injured when his aircraft, during an operational sortie in September 1939, had to crash land back on the German side. But he then went off to form the third wing of the Ace of Spades group. So he then took the better pilots with him, and that group did actually do quite well in the phony war. They met the Hurricanes, no Spitfires, of course, in France at that time. The Advanced Air Striking Force had Hurricanes, and every time there was a combat between the German fighters and the Hurricanes of one squadron, or the Hurricanes of 73 Squadron, invariably it was the Hurricanes that came off worst. But again, it was giving those Hurricane pilots a lot of experience, and it would be experience that would stand them in good stead in the Battle of France. You found that these Hurricane pilots then very rarely flew in the Battle of Britain, because again, like Werner Mulders, the experience they gained in France and the experience they gained in the phony war was better training the fighter pilots which were coming in. And of course, during the Battle of Britain, the RAF really did need fighter pilots. So what a better thing is to have sergeant pilots with a Distinguished Flying Medal, and officers with a Distinguished Flying Cross who had earned their spurs in France, getting in to teach these new boys coming into the squadrons. During the Battle of France was when the Ace of Spades squadron did exceptionally well. They were up against the Fairy Battle, a dreadful aircraft by all accounts. Irrespective of a Victoria Cross being won by two crews right at the start in what was a suicidal attack. Every time the German fighters bumped into these ferry battles, it was a slaughter. And you're finding in the first week in May 1940, following the invasion on the 10th of May, every time the poor ferry battles went up against the Germans to bomb bridges or bomb armored columns, above them there would be Messerschmitt 109s which would pounce on them, and as a result there would be horrific casualties. By this stage, Werner Mulders had gone and he'd handed over command of the squadron to a guy called Hans Karl Mayer. Again, Mayer had flown in Spain, and he was distinctive by, he was 6'3", 6'4", and he was, if you see photographs of the gentleman, he was considerably higher than taller than the rest of his squadron. And the cockpit in a Messerschmitt 109 was very, very cramped. And people who I interviewed afterwards say watching him trying to get into the cockpit of a 109 was quite something. But irrespective, he was still a top scoring pilot in Spain, and was very quick to increase his scores both over France and in the Phoney War. The German squadron got through France relatively unscathed. A couple of the inexperienced pilots were shot down by return fire and were captured. Very, very few were killed. And of course, at the end of the Battle of France, the German prisoners of war were handed back to the Germans. One of the chaps who'd been shot down and taken prisoner was, here's a cup of coffee, which is very good. And the dog has not come in, so that's a good sign. Werner Mulders had proven himself to be a very, very successful fighter pilot, and by the end of May 1940, he had got over 20 aerial victories, which resulted in, he was the first fighter pilot to be awarded the Knight's Cross. Now that's not his, but that's the Knight's Cross, and this is the thing you see the Germans they would wear there. 6 days after he was awarded the Knight's Cross, he was shot down by a very, very young French fighter pilot, who was then shot down and killed by his wingman, by Mulders' wingman. And Mulders, after about a couple of hours of trying to evade, was captured by the French. We, the RAF, didn't move quick enough. If we had, we would have saved ourselves a lot of grief. But the French hung on to him, and about 2-3 weeks later, when the French capitulated, Mulders was handed back over to the Germans, and he then took command of a whole group of Messerschmitt 109s, and he'd taken command at the beginning of July 1940. And as I said, going back to the Ace of Spades unit, they finished up the Battle of France at Rennes in Brittany, or almost in Brittany, and that's when the Battle of Britain began, where they would start their forays over Britain. Now, Rennes is quite a long way from the coast, and as we've said many times with my talks, the Messerschmitt 109 really didn't have that good a range. So what they would do is they would forward base at Cherbourg. As people know, Cherbourg sticks out quite a bit, and for those aviators among us, when you take off out of Southampton and get to altitude, you can see the French coast, you can see Cherbourg. So it was a great advantage when you phone your Messerschmitt 109 forward and you're right on the coast in Cherbourg, and you can refill your aircraft with fuel, you can maximize the time in combat over the likes of Portland and Portsmouth and Southampton. They didn't really do anything in July. They were on rest and recuperation, most of them, and sort of getting over the trials and tribulations of the Battle of France. But they first went into action on the 11th of August 1940. This was in response to a convoy which was off the Isle of Wight, and again they didn't have much success that day. Everybody else did in the wing, but Hans Karl Mayer and his pilots, they got back without a scratch, but they didn't shoot anything down. The days that followed, though, they did do exceedingly well. 12th of August, 13th of August, you see them bouncing squadrons of Hurricanes, bouncing squadrons of Spitfires and doing exceptionally well. There is one sad incident where Hans Carl Mayer led a bounce on a Vic, a 3-aircraft formation of Hurricanes, and he picked off the left-hand one, his wingman picked off the right-hand one, and the one in the middle, who was the more experienced pilot, both the two pilots to the side were Czech, who had just joined the squadron, and the chap who was left with the RAF pilot, he was then picked off by Mayer. But Mayer was, every time he was coming up against a hit Spitfire and Hurricane, he was successfully leading his squadron in bouncing them and getting back without a scratch. They got through these early skirmishes with only a few bullet holes in the aircraft, but they didn't suffer any casualties at all. Wind forward now until the days I did mention where the JG53 did meet up with 609 Squadron. So the 24th of August was a fighter sweep in support of a bombing raid on Portsmouth. Again, the German squadron claimed 2 Spitfires. One was from 609 Squadron, which took cannon shells up the fuselage into the armor plating. That was done by Hans Carl Mayer, irrespective of how tight he was in the cockpit of his aircraft. And his wingman then broke away and shot down Pilot Officer Jan Zurakovsky of 234 Squadron, who successfully bailed out. And he then would go on to join 609 Squadron at the end of the Battle of Britain. So the first skirmish between 609 Squadron and its German equivalent was Germany 2, England 0. The following day, 609 and the German squadron were very, very active in action. A number of claims by 609 Squadron for Messerschmitt 109s and Messerschmitt 110s, and they were quite successful. And likewise, exactly the same for the German side. But then you see the first loss, as we mentioned last time, for this German squadron in the Battle of Britain. A guy called Josef Broker, he'd only joined the squadron, the German squadron, around about 15th, 16th of August. How do we know that? Because he was there when the Spitfire, flown by Richard Hardy of 234 Squadron, landed at Cherbourg, having strayed a bit too far back, chasing German aircraft across the channel. And he actually went around and took lots of photographs of it. He flew one mission before then being shot down by one Spitfire and 2 Hurricanes, a Spitfire of 152 Squadron, a Hurricane of 87 Squadron, and a Hurricane of 213 Squadron. And it was he who managed to crash land his aircraft, then jumped out of his aircraft and thought that he would do the right thing by setting it on fire, by not realizing that he himself had got fuel on himself. So when he set fire to a rag, it set fire to him, and he ended up in hospital. That was the first casualty that the German squadron suffered in the Battle of Britain. However, from now on, the casualties would start to rise. The 26th of August, you see Mayer shooting down another 2 Spitfires, this time in support of a German bombing raid on Portsmouth. But during the return flight, a guy called Heinrich Besner, who was the first pilot of the whole group to shoot down something at the start of the war in September 1939. It is believed that he either suffered an engine failure or that he had been damaged in combat. But to cut a long story short, his Messerschmitt 109 was just seemed to tip forward, plunge into the sea south of the Isle of Wight, and about exactly a month later, his body was washed ashore and was buried with full military honours. But now we see a change. This is the last time for a good couple of months that 609 Squadron and the German squadron will be in the same air or the same combats together. Because, as we said before, the change of tactics, i.e. the bombing of London, you see all these Messerschmitt 109s moving up to the Pas-de-Calais. Those of you who know the area and are historians like myself, you will go from village to village to village in the Pas-de-Calais and know that there would have been a wing or a group or a squadron of ME 109s based there. You know, basic cornfields. Now there would have been cornfields there, but of course, you know, as soon as you got airborne and put your undercarriage up, you could see Dover, and of course that made it much easier for the fighters to get into London and to stay with the bombers. They arrived there on about the 30th of August 1940. They were just south of the Touquet is where they were based, and their first mission was an escort mission where nothing happened. But Mayer decided that they would have a bit of fun shooting down the barrage balloon barrage at Dover. And a friend of mine who's long dead, who was taking part in that mission, said that it was quite exciting because, of course, you were shooting down things which weren't shooting back at you. And he, being a very, very young pilot, he was only 20 at the time, remembers coming in so low and pulling up to actually shoot at one of these barrage balloons to see it explode and then fall down towards him. So he had to bank away fairly rapidly. Sadly, this pilot didn't last much longer. His name was Werner Karl. Again, as I said, he was 20. He was quite an experienced pilot by then, despite his age. He was damaged in combat on the 2nd of September 1940, and he with a Hurricane of 253 squadron. And he had the misfortune then, as he sort of turned back for the safety of France with an aircraft which was coughing and spluttering, to have one of the top scorers of the RAF came in behind him, which was Sergeant James Ginger Lacey of 501 Squadron. And I put the two of them in touch with each other, and Ginger Lacey sadly died of cancer shortly after being put in touch. It was 10 years later, sadly, that the German pilot died of cancer. And Ginger Lacey remembered it very clearly because he was very skillful. He just sat in the German fighter's blind spot and just took a little pot shot here, a little pot shot there, just putting a little bit more damage into the aircraft. He didn't particularly want to damage the pilot, but he wanted to bring the aircraft down. And the 20-year-old German pilot realized he couldn't get back, and he crash landed his aircraft on an army range at Dymchurch. And he said he'd never ever felt so lonely in his life as he sort of stepped out of his aircraft, which was the engines phased by there, and he handed over his pistol to an army officer. And as he looked up, the remainder of his squadron were going back to France, where they would be enjoying themselves, having a glass of wine. But again, they would be toasting his departure. Same mission. Another pilot, who was the pilot who actually collided with the 609 Squadron flight commander in June 1941. His aircraft was badly damaged in combat, and he bailed out over the channel, and he was picked up very rapidly. His name was Heinrich Ruhl. But by now, there are lots of changes going on in the German fighter force. It had been found that what the Germans wanted, were far more aggressive, far younger fighter pilots to lead their units. So the likes of Mulders, who was in his mid to late 20s, lots of combat experience. He wasn't a sort of a professional officer who joined in the 20s. He joined in the 30s, and he was replacing the old and bold pilot. The chap he took over from, in fact, was a fighter pilot in the First World War. And you also see then a number of people within the Ace of Spades unit going. One of the first to go was Hans Karl Mayer. He was awarded the Knight's Cross, and he actually took command of the wing. So he took command of the three squadrons underneath him. A popular move because he was a very popular officer, and he took over from a chap who didn't actually fly that often in combat and had very little combat experience. The other two squadron commanders, one went to fly alongside Adolf Galland, because Galland was given the command of a whole group of fighters. He too was awarded the Knight's Cross, and the final one went to another Me-109 squadron. His name was Wolfgang Lippert, and he too was awarded the Knight's Cross later in the summer. So you can see how successful those pilots had. Each of them, by the time they had been awarded the Knight's Cross, had 20 victories to their name, considerably more than their RAF counterparts. It should be worth mentioning now that of the three that got promoted and moved away, Lippert was shot down in North Africa by a Kitty Hawk of 250 Squadron and died in hospital, whilst the other guy, Pingle, who went to fly with Adolf Galland, was shot down chasing a Sterling back across the channel and crash landed his Messerschmitt 109 just outside Dover, handing the RAF the latest example of a Messerschmitt 109. He did try to set fire to it because, of course, it was a brand new aircraft. It's an Me-109F, but he was persuaded otherwise by a burst of Bren gun fire over his head. But again, we managed to get that aircraft flying, and in fact it crashed in 1942 in an accident, being flown by a Polish pilot. By now, the battles for London were starting to come to a crescendo. You see the next pilot from the first squadron of JG-53 being shot down. He's shot down by 19th Squadron and crashes just off the airfield at Biggin Hill. His name was Heinrich Honisch. He had, by this stage, shot down 5 aircraft. He'd flown right the way through the Battle of France, shot down 2 aircraft in France, and then shot down 3 aircraft already in the Battle of Britain. He was only a sergeant pilot, but he bailed out badly wounded when his aircraft caught fire. After that, the worst day for JG-53 is Battle of Britain Day, 15th of September 1940. You see that day, Hans Karl Mayer had gone back to Germany to receive the award of the Knight's Cross, so he wasn't commanding that day. But that day, his replacement, his aircraft suffered engine failure and handed over to a warrant officer, and the warrant officer was leading a squadron, and that squadron did have officers in it. But this guy, again, was a pilot who had fought in the Spanish Civil War, so he had considerable combat experience. That day, we see losses from a guy called Heinrich Schopper. He shouldn't have been flying that day because he should have been going back to Germany to marry his fiancée, who was pregnant with their first child. He was shot down and taken prisoner. He too was badly burnt. The chap who was leading the squadron, the warrant officer called Muller, he was bounced, wounded badly in the first combat, ditched in a channel and was captured. He was returned to Germany in 1944, but then died of pneumonia, sadly. We see a couple of claims by JG-53, but again, there's more losses that day. As you know, if those who've been taking part in this over the past coming weeks, you'll realise there were a lot of people, a lot of German fighters were shot down that day. And actually, you see that day that there's an actual change there for the Ace of Spades pilots. They don't shoot down anything else for the rest of the Battle of Britain. They have to go off and lick their wounds. They've lost so many people on the 15th of September. They go away, and then they start their job from then on is escorting fighter bombers. The new tactics that the Germans came up with, which was taking a Messerschmitt 109, strapping a bomb to it, flying across at 25,000 feet, dropping the bomb, then becoming a fighter, and then sort of going back. Their job then for the rest of the Battle of Britain tended to be these sort of escort missions, and they didn't have much success. However, with the lack of success did come continuous losses. 5th of October, on a fighter bomber mission, not only is the squadron commander of the fighter bomber squadron shot down and taken prisoner, but 2 pilots are shot down and taken prisoner. Again, so far you're saying most of you understand when I put the squadron back together again 10, 15 years ago, they were lucky that so few of them had been killed in the Battle of Britain, and quite a lot of them had been taken prisoner. But before the Battle of Britain ended, the biggest blow to JG-53, or to the first squadron, came. On the 17th of October was yet another fighter bomber mission, and again it was fraught with disaster. Aircraft were breaking down. They'd been working so hard that they were suffering mechanical failures, and as they approached the coast, the RAF had now realised that these fighter bombers, which again, they weren't much threat dropping one bomb, but because they were increasing, now was a time to actually take them on. So we start seeing a massive battle, and we start seeing a number of the aircraft from the squadron returning back home, both with damaged. A couple of aircraft had crash landed, and pilots had been taken prisoner. And it is thought that Mayer could hear what was going on. He wasn't flying that day, Hans Karl Mayer. He was back at base. He just returned from leave, where he'd actually found out that his wife was pregnant with their first child, a daughter, as it turns out, who was born in July 1941, Hannah Birgit, and he must have returned refreshed. Photographs of him by now. He's a very, very tired-looking man. He'd been working in combat from September 1939 until now, October the 17th, 1940. What exactly happened next is not really known, but cut a long story short, he took an aircraft to go out to assist his wing, which were up against at least 4 or 5 squadrons of Spitfires and fighting for their lives. It is believed that as he approached by himself, he was bounced by 2 Spitfires of Treble 2 Squadron, and he was last seen plunging straight into the sea. A month later, his body, the body of a Hauptmann, so a flight lieutenant, with a Knight's Cross, with the name Mayer, was washed up at Dymchurch. He was buried on the day they found him. They misspelled his name, but it's been proven now that the body that was washed up was Hans Karl Mayer. Morale-wise, the Germans were not very happy, were very, very, very sad at the loss of such an enigmatic and popular person. So the 3 guys from the group, which we've just talked about there, 2 get killed, 1 get killed in 1940, 1 gets killed in 1941, 1 gets taken prisoner in 1941. So you can see, you know, they might have survived the Battle of Britain, but the war had a long way to go, and they didn't get on much further after that. Battle of Britain over, the number of missions decrease for the German squadron. They are still carrying out fighter sweeps across the Channel, but as I said before, they're not shooting anything down. They're not meeting that, and again, they suffer a number of losses. One of them was shot down. A new pilot who'd been posted to the squadron to make up for the losses. He was shot down by Sailor Milan, the enigmatic South African-born commanding officer of a Spitfire squadron, who then went to be one of the first wing commanders and commanded the wing at Biggin Hill, and was the person, a bit like Moulders, who actually came up with the 10 rules of air fighting. Again, if you ever want to see that, I believe there's a copy of that in the RAF museum, and it's basically his aggressive way of get in, get out, you know, don't follow them down, and it was to teach the younger fighter pilots there. He was the successful pilot of shooting down one of the last of JG-53's aircraft just before Christmas. They were withdrawn back to Germany for rescue and recuperation, where they were then re-equipped with the Messerschmitt 109F. They then come back to the Channel front in about April 1941, but then in June 1941 move off to the Russian front to take part in Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. So what happens to them after that? They continue in Russia. They go to North Africa. They are involved. They come back for a very short period of time to the Channel coast, where, funny old thing, they get commanded by the pilot known as the one that got away, Franz von Vera, the only German fighter pilot to escape from a prisoner of war camp and make it back to Germany. He made it back in late 1940, early 1941, after escaping in Canada and getting across into America before America joined the war. He then gets command of what was Mayer's wing, only to be killed in an accident in October 1941. Again, a man that everybody would have seen Hardy Kruger playing his part. Well, he actually commanded that wing that carried that badge on the aircraft. They are involved in the Mediterranean. They're involved still flying the Messerschmitt 109 and in newer versions right up until the end of the war in the defense of the Reich. And as a result of it, a lot of them get highly decorated, but very, very, very few of them actually survive the war. And in fact, the ones who were shot down and taken prisoner during the Battle of Britain were the lucky ones to have survived the war. Some of them went through some fairly dreadful experiences as the war went on, because they were finding it harder and harder to take on a superior number of Russian aircraft and superior numbers of RAF and American aircraft, which of course became more technologically superior. So there you go. So that's the Brothers in Arms. That's the second part of the story. So you've heard the RAF side, you've now heard the German side. Bit of a gamble through, because I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, because otherwise I'll end up speaking German and be losing you people. But that's the story about the Brothers in Arms. I will be this afternoon starting the index on the book, which is being reprinted in paperback and will be out hopefully in the next month or so. So I hope you found that interesting, and I can now have a quick sip of my coffee, which is just about going cold. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll leave it to you if you have any more questions.